Hello and welcome to our web chat on ISO 20022 Migration for Corporates. We are joined by Daniel Schwefer, Director at Deutsche Bank's Global Transaction Banking. He's in charge of the Strategic Payment Data and Global ISO 20022 Migration Initiatives. Previous to this, he's had many different roles inside Deutsche Bank's payment, product development and business architecture. Welcome.
Thanks for the invite, Jack.
No problem. Looking forward to this. Before we start, though, Daniel, ISO 20022 has been around since at least 2004, and actually a lot earlier. What is so significant now? What's bringing it to a head? What's the reason for moving to ISO 20022?
You're right, Jack. ISO 20022 is a well-known set of standards for not only payments, but also for payments. And it is used by corporate clients for many years already to communicate with their banks when it comes to payment instructions, but also when it comes to account information. What changes the picture now completely is that ISO 20022 standards will be used in the complete value chain of a payment, specifically now in the communication between banks and market infrastructures. So we will see a common set of standards across the whole value chain of a payment, and that is really a new situation we are preparing for now.
And so that is why the ISO 20022 migration programs are started. Can you explain this? Because there's a lot of data here.
So if we look at this overview, what we see is that almost all primary market infrastructures for payments are now in the middle of modernizing their high-value payment systems at a pretty much similar time frame. If we look at this page and start on the second line, quoting Europe here, you see that, for example, the Target 2 system of the Eurosystem or the EBA clearing are in the middle of renewing their systems with a go-live date of the new system, and with the new ISO standards in November 2021. So they are in the very active program phase of implementing the new standard with a what we call Big Bang migration in November 2021, where all participants of this clearing need to be ready to communicate in ISO 20022. And if you look then at the next line to the UK, we see something that looks a little bit different. We have 4 different phases here with the preparation phase, an introductory phase, and then a more like-for-like migration in a first step where we will not implement full ISO, but a light version of ISO and enhance it over time. And something similar on the US side, where also some preparation to the legacy formats are the beginning, and then we are growing the rollout of the ISO standard. But it is almost happening at the same point in time with some differences in the actual full mature phase of ISO usage. Yep. And if we then go to the very top of the page, we see that SWIFT decided as well then to migrate to ISO 20022 for all communication between banks worldwide. So the traditional correspondent banking communication will introduce ISO 20022 message flows in November 2021 as well, with a what they call coexistence phase. So it will be launched in parallel to the old message formats used in this space. And nevertheless, it should allow for a holistic front-to-back implementation of ISO 20022 in international payment.
This smells of trouble, though, because what happens if these things get out of sync?
So you're right. This is one of the biggest challenges I see in this project at the moment. We need to orchestrate and harmonize our approach to all these market infrastructure changes. That starts internally inside the bank to treat this as one big effort and not as isolated country-specific initiatives. What we try to achieve at the moment is a consistent interpretation of the ISO standard for the specific needs of cross-border payments, and to harmonize the usage rules, network validation rules, and also the expectations for payment users for our corporate clients to the extent possible. There will be differences in some local implementations, and you can assume that the list doesn't stop with the clearinghouses mentioned here. There are more countries joining this. There will be differences in certain countries, but we need to achieve as much standardization as possible. And we also need to avoid that significant market joins this discussion at a much later point in time, because that would create complexity for all participants.
And it's complex enough. But another level of complexity is the fact that ISO 20022 is not only being used in high-value payments, but in other payment systems as well. How is that being coordinated?
So I look at this at a completely separate exercise. ISO 20022, you're right, is also used in other schemes. We see it as best practice in the new upcoming real-time payment schemes or instant payment schemes around the world. And we also see it in some of the automatic clearinghouses. In fact, it is the basis for use in SEPA already. The difference here is that specifically when you look at these new payment schemes, real-time payment schemes, they are being launched as new schemes using this standard. Whilst here on the high-value payment space, we talk about a migration of an existing ecosystem.
Yep. Okay, so if we look at the benefits and the challenges, this is a very busy slide. Talk us through it.
So let's start with the challenges. And I think the first point here already repeats what you already identified as a challenge. If we don't get things completely in sync, we have to deal with the consequences of coexistence of old and new standards, and with the knock-on effects that this will have if you introduce converter solutions between new and old standards. If you take a complex structured instruction in ISO format and then convert it into an old Swift message that is currently used in this space, you probably lose data, and that could have implications for corporate clients not seeing everything in their account statements or whatever. And that's something we need to manage in a very diligent way to avoid this. The second big challenge is obviously the complexity and size of this effort. It is one of the biggest industry undertakings in the payment space for the last years, and the implementation cost of this, definitely on the bank side, but potentially also on the corporate side, should not be underestimated. It is not only about implementing a new standard, it is for banks also about a new operating mode, changing the way how we communicate with our market infrastructures, not going into the details here, but it's more than just a new message format. And we have to coordinate this across the industry. It doesn't work if one bank makes this interpretation and another bank makes a different interpretation of the standard. And it needs to work hand in hand with the industry representatives of our clients, with the corporate organizations.
So there must be some benefits, surely.
Well, sure, that's what we all hope for, right? So obviously there are some benefits just coming from the fact that we have a standards set for the full value chain of a payment. We expect efficiency gains from this. We expect that there are less breaks in processing if we have an orchestrated approach to standards used for payment instructions from corporates to us as banks, from banks to other banks, and to the market infrastructure. So there should be efficiencies, cost savings, less delays, less breaks in the process. That's obviously the biggest expectation we have.
But there's also the digital compliance and new improved services. You're not going to just do this and stop there. You're going to be developing new services, aren't you?
Definitely, that's something that will be enabled with the new standard. But maybe to start with the digital compliance topic you mentioned, what we have to find a response for is the challenge of looking at payment transactions from various different angles as a bank to address all types of risk in terms of anti-money laundering, risk sanctions screening, fraud detection. All these kind of obligations banks have when performing payment processing require a better and more structured approach to payment data. And that's obviously something that will be introduced with ISO 20022. It will be much easier, and with coming with less breaks and less problems, if we have structured data about all participants in the payment in an ISO format, instead of looking at the very legacy data structures used in this space. And Yes, you're right. ISO will also allow for new services. ISO 20022 will introduce certain attributes in payment instructions that we haven't seen before to respond to further automation needs on the reconciliation side with structured remittance information, but also to create a room for additional parties in payment flows to have ultimate debtors and ultimate creditor information in the messages. And there is a big opportunity to build consistent services across the globe, leveraging these data elements.
Oh dear, I thought you were really going to tell us about new products. Let's move on and have a look at what you're recommending that corporates have to do to survive, I think is the way this momentous change.
Well, it is not completely new to corporates to use ISO formats, as we said at the beginning, right? The currently used messages for payment instructions, called pain messages, and for cash management or account information, they will be supported as we have them at the moment. So corporate clients already using ISO formats will continue using them as today. They will also be allowed to use the old versions of these ISO formats because ISO goes through a different versioning approach, but it is possible to continue with your current setup if you want.
How possible is that?
Well, it is potentially not a big problem if you continue with very simple standardized payment flows. Where I think where it becomes difficult is if you really want to leverage everything that will be enabled by this consistent value chain-wide implementation of the new standard. So some of the newest features of ISO probably also require corporate clients to change to the latest version of ISO payment instructions and account statements, because otherwise, if you don't go for the latest version, you will not be able to, for example, look at specific reference numbers being introduced with Swift GPI, for example, and these things are missing if you stick to the old versions of ISO. It will also be possible to still use the old FIN messages that are used in SCORE framework or in closed user groups for corporates, but we have the same limitation there. Not everything that is possible in the ISO front-to-back processing will be supported by these old messages, so it's worthwhile looking into it. And then there are problem areas that I would recommend to really look into. If you're a corporate client and you receive payments, you have to expect that you receive payments in ISO format with much more information than you expected or that you see it today. So you might receive a payment with much more rich and structured remittance information, or you might receive a payment where an ultimate debtor is mentioned in the payment. And if you then look at your account information, your statements, your electronic banking, you have to deal with more data than you receive today, irrespective of whether you become an active user of ISO formats or not. It's just the fact that you receive something with more data. And your bank needs to make provisions for this and needs to help you understanding how to read these incoming payment instruction payment messages best. And second big challenge here is that there will be a mandatory use of structured party information in ISO 20022, so that there is probably an expectation for corporate clients to provide beneficiary information in a different way compared to today. So to look at data quality in the beneficiary information.
That sounds quite a complex issue. One, because it's a new field, but two, it's understanding the implications and what to do with the data. Will Deutsche, for example, be providing this sort of assistance?
I think it is an absolute must-have to have this discussion, this dialogue between corporates and their banks. And we at Deutsche Bank side plan for this from the very early days of this program now to guide through these changing situations for our clients. I think it is critical to start this discussion now and not at a later point in time, although the actual market migration in the clearinghouses will happen in a few years only because of the complexity of this. So if we look at the right side of this page, what I say here is that it's not yet completely clear what the implications will be. Some of them I mentioned already, but I think the dialogue needs to start. We need to look explicitly at the account information, as I mentioned, to see that whatever is being presented to our corporate clients is understood and doesn't break the reconciliation process. I would recommend to start conversations with the system providers on the corporate side to understand their approach of how they will support ISO 20022 in the ERP systems. And I think it is also worthwhile considering an in-house coordination on the client side for this global industry change to mitigate any risk of different ISO implementations in different regions. I said earlier that we try to harmonize this as much as possible to the extent it is in our remit as a bank, but this global coordination, this global look at this initiative is also something worthwhile establishing on the client
side. And that's by the corporate, it isn't just by the bank.
It is indeed. It is, I think, on all levels. It is something that luckily happens as a conversation on central bank level. It is something that the banking industry is being now teaming up for to harmonize the approach. But I think also within a corporate treasury organization, it makes sense to look at this globally to understand what are the implications of a specific flavor of ISO implementation in a certain region of the world to have an understanding of this complexity.
So not only do you understand the opportunities, but you actually understand the administrative gremlins and problems that you're going to have if you don't coordinate this.
Absolutely. But we should also start a discussion on the opportunities, right? It is not only a big, challenging program to change to a new format, it is also something that allows for new services. And also this development of new services on the back of these new standards is something where the communication between corporates and banks need to start now. Otherwise, we cannot see or we will not have the benefits of this investment, and we should definitely benefit from this.
This is mostly good news, but my question would be, what if I don't do anything? If I do nothing, I'm going to just sit back and stay with what I've got already.
I think, Jack, in the majority of cases, that will work for the time being if a corporate will not change the processing completely. I think it is, at minimum, a missed opportunity to go for more standardization, more harmonization, and with this also for more automation in the end-to-end process. But I think there is a risk that certain processes on the reconciliation side will be negatively impacted if a corporate would do nothing. And that's why I think it's important to discuss it with the banks, how these implications can be managed.
This is both fascinating and important. How would you sum up what to do next? What would be your closing comment?
Well, I think the adoption of ISO 20022 standards in the interbank communication, it will significantly improve the whole payment value chain. The whole ecosystem will benefit from this, from higher automation rates, and as I said, also from the option to introduce new products on this basis. But it comes with the challenges that we discussed for all market participants, including our corporate clients, as they have to receive and potentially also provide better and more structured data when doing payments. I think it's just important to acknowledge that this is now the point in time where the discussion between corporates and banks need to start to assess the practical implications of this, as well as the opportunities.
So you've got to do something now.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's really interesting.
Thanks for the invite, Jack.